Well, I thought that I'd become a physician because I saw how people respected my father for what he did in that regard. He was kind to them, empathetic. They respected him. I think he made them feel better, both physically and emotionally. And I thought that would be something that would be wonderful. And then when you add the science and you add new things that were happening, that was exciting. My father had a little bit of a tradition because when he was a medical student in Germany, his physics professor, who was an elderly man at that time, his name was Röntgen, and he discovered X-rays. So science, time passes. I thought this was a wonderful thing to be doing. And I once thought I'd be a music critic. It didn't work out that way. And so my music professors said, go to medical school. If you don't like it, here's my phone number. You can call. But I was very happy to be at Harvard Medical School. There was no oncology when I was in medical school. It was not a defined specialty. It was something that developed during the time that I was in training. But I was at Harvard from 1965 to 1969. Cancer was a surgeon's domain, and there was no medical oncology. But I was a third-year medical student, and I was assigned to Children's Hospital to have a 6-week rotation in pediatrics. And one of the first few days I was there was a new attending on the floor, a senior doctor. And he was a little gruff. He was a little bit impatient, but there was something about him that just really was exciting. And some of the trainees, the residents who were there at that time, observed that. And about an hour after he left, I was admitted a young boy, 3 years old, from the inner city who had lead poisoning. And I remember they taught me everything about lead poisoning. And the next day, when that attending came to for teaching rounds, I knew more about lead poisoning probably than he did, and we took a liking to each other. And that attending was David Nathan, who subsequently became president of Dana-Farber and remains a major mentor in my career. I became interested in hematology. I liked pediatric hematology in large part because of the group that David had, Dr. Nathan had. And shortly before I graduated from medical school, he summoned me to his home one night in Cambridge, and I thought I must have done something terribly wrong. And I showed up, and he shoved this pile of paper at me and said, fill this out and have it back tomorrow or the day after. And it was an application to go to the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, for training. I never thought that an opportunity like that would come to me. He said, don't worry about it, just fill it out. So I filled it out, and to my surprise, I had 11 interviews. And I went down to the NIH and came back, and the first day of my residency, there was an overhead page for me, and at the other end was the NIH offering me a position. So I spent 2 years as a medical resident, and then I went to the NIH in Bethesda, and they assigned me in the National Cancer Institute as a trained internist to treat children with leukemia. And I learned more in that 1 year clinical medicine and how to talk to people. It was an amazing experience. Then I spent 2 years in a basic science laboratory. And after I was there for a year or two, I was thinking, what would I do with my life? And I had just gotten married. and I thought I needed more training, maybe in hematology. And there were traditional training programs around the country in Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, and Stanford, and other places. And suddenly, David Nathan reappeared. There was a phone call and said, I'm going to be in the garden of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington a week from Tuesday. You be there. Yes, sir. So I showed up, and he said, there is a man that has just been recruited to come to Boston. His name is Emil Fry. He's called Tom Fry, and I want you to meet him, because I think you ought to come back to Boston, and this is a fabulous opportunity for you and for us. So, okay, I flew up to Boston on a Saturday. I spent the day with Tom Fry. We made rounds on a patient of his who was being treated for a bone cancer. He happened to be the son of a Massachusetts senator. And by the end of the day, Dr. Fry offered me a position. And he said, I want you to come back after your third year at the NIH, where he had been as well. And he said that I would spend 1 year as a special fellow, and then I would be on the faculty. Wow, I didn't need a plane to take me back to Washington. I could fly by myself. But then I didn't hear anything. And then I got a letter in the mail, and the letter was from, of all people, Dr. Farber, Sidney Farber, who I had not met personally, but I'd seen from a distance. And he offered me a fellowship for 1 year. And I don't know whether he agreed with or knew about what Dr. Fry had proposed for me. But I was a little bit uncertain about whether to take that, because there were uncertainties here. And I had a young family coming along, and I wanted a little bit of security. And then David Nathan got on the phone. We have to know. You can't. You've got to tell us. And so back and forth it went, and finally decided that this was an opportunity and I should do it. And the other places that I looked at were more set in their ways, and this was a tabula rasa. It was an open opportunity to become a teacher, to become an investigator, to be part of a new wave of a new field that was just finding its way and having actually some role in defining it. So said yes. I remember my wife and I were shopping when we finally made that decision, and I put a dime in a payphone and called and said yes. I felt relieved because a decision had been made. And July 1st, 1974, I showed up and became part of what is now the Dana-Farber community, and probably the best professional decision I ever made. But who knew at that point? Today we think of oncology as being the ultimate in science. We learn how cells function. We learn how new forms of treatment can turn off genes, can turn on genes. We make vaccines for viral illnesses that come from information and technology that came from the science of oncology. But in 1974, none of that existed. The notion of chemotherapy came actually from an accident during World War II, which occurred when the Allies were invading or trying to get back into Italy in 1943 or so. And there were landing boats, but they had in them, mustard gas in case there were problems. They would waft the mustard gas, and one of those boats was sunk, and there were soldiers who were wading ashore and were exposed to it, and it was found that their blood counts dropped. And some very smart pharmacologists who actually became world-renowned put one and one together and said, gee, this chemical could have potential use in the treatment of cancers. People like Tom Fry learned about this. This was in their formative years. People learned about animal models to explore whether this would work or not work. One of Tom Fry's closest associates, his name was Jay Fryreich, and Tom came to the notion that just like we treat an infectious disease like tuberculosis or a bacterial infection with more than one antibiotic, we should be treating cancer with more than one drug at a time. And when I was at the NIH and treating children with leukemia, there was a 4-drug combination that had been devised by Fry and Fryreich, which had led to a previously incurable process for which Sidney Farber had made the first step forward. But now with 4 drugs, not just one drug, which Dr. Farber had, 50% of those children were cured. This never happened before. So I came here with the notion that maybe it would be possible to be able to do this in more than one disease. And there were early data in Hodgkin's disease that this could happen. And shortly after I arrived here, in testicular cancer, that this could happen. So it was an enormous amount of optimism when I came here that this was a field that would emerge, the clouds would part. There weren't a lot of people who were heavily engaged in it. There was a strong feeling in the traditional, which could be also interpreted as conservative, medical hierarchy, that people like Fry and Fryreich, DeVita, people like that who were pioneers in oncology, were dreamers and were poisoning people much like the mustard gas was poisoning people. But it was the matter of learning what you could do with it and believing that if you did all these things, you could actually make progress. And a year after I came here, there was the first report of giving chemotherapy prophylactically for bone cancer, like the senator's son had, breast cancer, and extending life and curing people who otherwise couldn't have been cured. And the breast cancer data used more than one drug. So there was a great deal of excitement. When I came, Dana-Farber was one building. It was the Jimmy Fund building, which was the labs, the clinic. We had no inpatient beds. And there was a strong concern on the part of many of the people who were associated with Dana-Farber, which was then known as the Children's Cancer Research Foundation and the Jimmy Fund, that if too much attention, too many people were focusing on adult cancer, what would happen with the initiative that had led to the Jimmy Fund and the cures that were starting to be seen in childhood cancer? But of course, there are 11 or 12,000 children every year who develop cancer, and there are hundreds of thousands of adults. And sooner or later, this was a reality that had to be addressed. I'm not sure And there's no way that I would know whether Dr. Farber ever lay awake at night wondering how this would happen. But for Tom Fry, it was a slam dunk. This was who he was and what it was all about. And no question, he wanted that four-letter word cure in every paper you wrote, because if you didn't think positive things weren't going to happen. When I came to Dana-Farber, there had been a group of 6 or 7 trainees the year before. One of them, Leroy Parker, spent many years on our faculty as a distinguished breast cancer physician. But there were no real cancer centers. There were no training programs. And the programs that I had looked at before accepting the offer from Dr. Fry and Dr. Nathan, from Tom and David, were primarily hematology programs. Tom Fry, who everything in life was looking up, the positive, envisioned getting the best and the brightest and training them. And my 1 year as a special fellow ended on June 30 to 1975, and on July 1st, I was the attending. I was the senior doctor, much as Nathan had been years before when I had that interaction that was so important in my own development and that opportunity. There was nobody who was really running a fellowship program. There was nobody who was putting an education, a lecture series together, or principles of what you should know. There was a peer of mine on the pediatric side, Steve Sallin, who was starting to do that. I was doing it. We would have dinner 4 or 5 times a year, coming up with teaching programs that would attract trainees for pediatric oncology. It was hematology oncology in pediatrics. And we started recruiting people to be fellows here. The first day I was an attending, I remember we were asked to see a patient at the Brigham Hospital, and I had a first-year fellow with me who had just started. His name was Robert Comus, Bob Comus. He had come here from Syracuse. He was a disciple of a man named Arlen Gottlieb, who knew Tom Fry very well, and he became a very, very well-known lung cancer doctor, and he became the chair of the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group. I only say that to point out that one after the other, these people all went on, or most of them went on, to major leadership roles here. Many of them are still here in the Boston area, but for cancer centers in multiple cities, for departments of medicine. The present director of the National Cancer Institute was a Dana-Farber Fellow. I remember one of the opportunities that I had as in those early years was to become part of what's called the American Board of Internal Medicine. People are said to be board certified. Somebody has to write the board exam. And so I was invited to be part of the board in medical oncology, and they kept me on, and I did general internal medicine. And there was a man named John Stobo, Jack Stobo, and he was a rheumatologist at Johns Hopkins. He was the chair of medicine. He was originally from Framingham and was interested in what was happening here. And he said, you know, I have this very bright guy. I'd like to keep him as a chief resident at Hopkins, but would you think about, would he be a good person to train at Dana-Farber? And that's how Bill Kalin came to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. There weren't programs, but we created a program, and people sent us the best and the brightest. And that, I think, has been a tremendous thrill personally to watch the success that these people have had. In 1975, Tom Fry also recruited George Kanellis. I had met George Kanellis initially at the NIH on that day where I had 11 interviews that David Nathan had set up, and we both remembered that day. But George was the chief of medical oncology, and he put me in that role. Again, these were opportunities. Like the American Board of Internal Medicine didn't have medical oncology board till 1973. It didn't exist, and there were a small number of us around the country who knew enough that you could see the big picture. Tom Fry and Jim Holland together wrote a textbook called Cancer Medicine that was published in 1974. That was the first medical oncology textbook. The time that this program here began, the time that I was fortunate enough to come back to Boston, was all the pieces were fitting in place. And it was a perfect storm, if you will. And there were new drugs, and the pharmaceutical industry was fascinated by what could happen. And then there were the scientists here, David Livingston, who I had known at the NIH, Stuart Schlossman, who was an extremely bright immunologist. And then Dr. Benacerraf Baruch came from the medical school. And more people were recruited. And something also that was special about Dana-Farber, most places that became cancer or oncology focused were either research institutions or clinical facilities where there was some research that was ongoing. The belief here, the correct belief in my book, was that half the resources, the space, the money, the positions went to basic science or dry laboratories, epidemiology, biostatistics, and half of it went to clinicians. And that also made this unique. And that's a great compliment to Fry, to Kanellis, to Livingston, who unfortunately passed away this past year. But these people were making decisions on the fly, and they were the right decisions. So Tom Fry was a 6'4", 6'3", slender guy from St. Louis. His family came from Germany, and they made stained glass windows for churches or religious institutions, whatever denomination. And he went to Yale, and he met some pretty bright people. There was a man named Jack Strominger, who was a fantastic scientist and was a professor at Harvard University for many years and was instrumental in getting Tom to come to Boston from Houston, where he was. That was his last stop before Dr. Farber and Strominger and probably a lot of other people, including Dick Smith, our legendary board chair, brought him here. Tom had a wide number of interests. He was a guy who had curiosity beyond belief. He was very well read. In my first year here, we came in '74, somewhere around August. He was renting a house in Westwood, which had a good bit of land. Everybody who worked at Dana-Farber came for a picnic, and there was a softball game, and he was playing. He was right in the middle of everything, and he was also a guy you could just walk right into his office, and there was no pretense. He came to our conferences, and he gave people, again, opportunities. I came here as a person who was interested in leukemia because that was hematology, that was David Nathan, that's what I did at the NIH, or National Cancer Institute. Dana-Farber didn't have a lot of adults with leukemia at that point. But Dr. Fry, Tom, had just made a deal with the NCI to create a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional program to deal with gastrointestinal cancers. It involved the Mayo Clinic, Roswell Park, the University of Chicago, Sloan Kettering, all different places. And after a few months, he called me in and said, was I interested in being involved in that? And that's where my career in gastrointestinal malignancy began, because Tom Fry gave me the opportunity. And he gave other people similar opportunities, taught me a lot about mentorship, something Dana-Farber's been very strong in over the years. But if you don't give people a chance, they're never going to succeed. If you're the running back on a football team, you can open a hole in the line. Doesn't mean you're given a chance you're going to do well, but if you don't run for that hole, you're not going to succeed. And that's what happened here. And so many people benefited from that in different ways. I went to the NIH in 1971. I was at the National Cancer Institute treating children with leukemia. And that was the time that the war on cancer was legitimized, and the National Cancer Act was enacted. This is the 75th anniversary of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. It's the 50th anniversary of the National Cancer Act. I don't know that it would have been realistic to expect that the president signing a piece of paper would lead to cancer being cured, but it sure brought a lot of attention. It brought a lot of energetic minds. It supported research that allowed progress to be made. It legitimized oncology in the eyes of the medical establishment and made a tremendous impact on young people to be able to be part of this, because it was really exciting. You're combining ultimately the most esoteric science with the most basic emotion and empathetic care. And for people who are interested in being physicians, doing something new and different, nothing beat it at all. It was where to be. Dr. Benacerraf was a unique person. He was from Morocco, as I remember, and lived in Venezuela. He wrote an autobiography that described how he came to New York and being a foreign speaker and found that it was hard to gain access to traditional places, shall we say. So on the side, he ran a bank. And the bank was in Caracas, as I remember. And he commuted 1 week a month, and then found himself at New York University, where he conducted research on immunology that allowed people to learn how to more safely perform bone marrow and kidney and transplants, histocompatibility. He became very famous. He came to Boston, and he was chair of the pathology department at Harvard Medical School in the late 1970s. Well, the rumor on the street was that all the work with histocompatibility was going to get him a trip to Stockholm and a Nobel Prize. And the dean of Harvard Medical School at that time was no fool, Dan Tosteson. And what Dr. Tosteson wanted to do was make sure that when the Nobel Prize came, that it would be going to a person who was a Harvard Medical School faculty member. So as I understand what happened, Tosteson called Dick Smith and said, how can we retain Dr. Benacerraf, and how can we, since his interest was in the science of cancer, how can we find a role for him? And so they created for Dr. Benacerraf the title of president, technically over Tom Fry. Tom agreed to it. And in 1980, Baruch came to Dana-Farber, and that year he won the Nobel Prize. I had the privilege of knowing him quite well, and his wife and his daughter, and his son-in-law, who was the head of cardiology at the Brigham Hospital. He was again, somebody who could talk the finance with our trustees. He understood how budgets ran. He thought big. And there are still some of our emeritus trustees who speak of him in total awe. We were just, again, it was an opportunity. And it was an opportunity here given to us by the dean of Harvard Medical School to create a position for him. Well, the overdose was a seminal event in the history of Dana-Farber. And I think again, using that word opportunity, it was an opportunity to reassess who we were, who we should be, and what our future might be considered. Dr. Farber, who was a pathologist and was not somebody who day by day provided direct patient care, in designing what is now the Dana building, which had 3 clinical floors as an inpatient facility. It was 200 yards from a hospital that had an emergency room. It didn't have real night coverage. We were thinking big, but perhaps we were overambitious as we were moving ahead. The event of the overdose probably never would have happened a few years later when there were computers that checked everything. But in the early 1990s, these were still paper and handwritten. This tragic event occurred. David Nathan stepped into the breach and was our president for 5 or 6 years. He had, as he continues to have, enormous cachet, enormous respect in the Harvard Medical School and Harvard University community, and he stabilized what was happening. I remember when the thought of recruiting or twisting his arm to come here taught me again about leadership. And the leadership here was on the part of Dick Smith, because Nathan was asked to take on this responsibility, which he was a little bit ambivalent about doing. Dick talked him into it, but Dick also called each one of us independently, knowing how painful the overdose experience had been, to ask whether we agreed that David Nathan would be the right person to take us forward. And that taught me about touching base and making sure that you had your ducks in order. And Dick did that at that point. David, from I think almost the moment he took that job, was looking to identify his successor. And Ed Benz had been one of his trainees. Ed had been a Harvard medical student and a Brigham resident. He knew everybody here. He had been the head of the hematology program at Yale. He had been the chair of medicine at the University of Pittsburgh and then at Johns Hopkins. He knew his ropes, and he was an inspired choice because he was part of a wave of growth, and we were very fortunate to have him for what must have been 10, 12 years in that role before Laurie Glimcher was recruited. But he really was able to restructure particularly the whole clinical organization in a way that benefited the institution, and also was able to negotiate Dana-Farber's role and position in the Harvard Medical School universe, if you will. So again, we've been just very fortunate in the choice of leaders. Opportunities for individual people need to play to their strengths. Ed Benz was primarily a hematologist who worked, as David Nathan did, on hemoglobin, which is and was very, very successful in that regard, and thinks as a scientist. Laurie is a world-class immunologist. The focus of where this institution needed to go changed, not because one was better or different than the other, but because the questions that needed to be asked were different. She also has turned out to be a superb spokesperson for the institution at a time when we need to be thinking about diversity and equity in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of staffing, and dealing with a pandemic, which I'm sure none of us were prepared for. We've weathered a huge storm in large part because of her leadership and the people that she has brought around her. I'm sure if you ask her, she's probably going to say she's only warming up, and now you ain't seen nothing yet. And I'm sure that that's very true. I don't know that Tom Fry would have related to the science of this any more than Laurie would have related to the questions that Tom was working on. They were different people, each one of them in the right spot at the right time. And that's what makes this institution so special. Well, cancer treatment, medical cancer treatment, when it began in the era of Tom Fry, was giving cellular poisons with a thought that the cancer cell would be damaged and couldn't repair itself, whereas the accompanying normal cell would be able to do so. Some people who didn't believe in that all that strongly equated that to a high-pressure fire hydrant, where the pressure of the water knocks everything down, but the normal cell can grow back and the abnormal cell can't. In the 1980s, led by people like David Livingstone, one of our trainees, whose name was Brian Drucker, who is now at the University of Oregon, the notion of targeted therapy began. Targeted therapy where there is one weak spot in the molecular structure of the cancer cell, and if you can fit the right jigsaw puzzle piece into that, you can selectively knock off just the cancer cells without damaging anything else. And in some diseases, chronic myelogenous leukemia, that's what Drucker did with Gleevec, very famous observation that came originally from here. But in melanoma, Steve Hody was very much involved in that. And in lung cancers, with the EGFR, the epidermal growth factor receptor inhibitors, that occurred. But that didn't do it for every cancer. But then the immunotherapy began here and in other places. And to have that emerge and have your president being somebody for whom this is her bread and butter, this is who she is, it's been a progression, one step after the other. And we've been lucky to have leadership that resonates to each of them, each of those approaches, each of those technological strategies, and have them at the right time, at the right place, and having the resources that this institution has always received from donors, going back to the Jimmy Fund and continuing the Jimmy Fund, but as the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, small gifts, huge gifts, enormous gifts, and done very well also obtaining federal grants. So it's been a very fortunate ride, and I'm sure we haven't seen where it's really going to go. It still has a lot to offer. So when I had dark hair, and I would come and make rounds on weekends, my daughter Erica would come along. And when she was in high school, we thought maybe she would like to spend some time in a lab here. Probably was too early at that point. So when she was in college, we looked at that again, and she spent a couple summers working with in the lab of Stu Orkin, and there was this fellow, Ramesh Shivdasani, and they had a wonderful time, and they published, and it was great stuff. So when she was a medical student here, there wasn't any question what she was going to do. and she found that breast cancer was gave her at least some independence from me, because that's not what I did. And she is doing very well, and couldn't be prouder. And so we as a family have been part of this institution since 1974. And again, it's an opportunity. And it's been a wonderful opportunity for all of us. My wife, Jane, has been involved with Dana-Farber since the inception of the Friends of Dana-Farber here. We've regularly participated in fundraising in Palm Beach and in other places for the for the Institute. My wife was the director of the social work department at what became the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and after she retired, she had this passion for art, and there were walls here in Dana-Farber that she thought could be more interesting. And through the Friends, with the great support of the Friends and many of the women who she's known for many years, the art program at Dana-Farber grew, and now is hums like a machine. Not only do the walls at the main campus have her imprimatur, but also at Chestnut Hill, at South Shore, at Milford, and now she's working on Foxborough. So it's we do a lot of talking about what will make Dana-Farber appear more interesting and comforting to our patients. One other thing I would add is that choosing art for a hospital where the consumer, the patient, is feeling poorly, is sick, the images of what's there can be fabulously comforting and exciting, or could be the color of their chemotherapy or something that looks barren or cold. And Jane has a committee and staff from Dana-Farber who help prioritize and decide and help to do this in a way that will be a win-win situation. And I think she's succeeded marvelously. We're so proud of her for that. I view this as a destination place. I view this as a place where if you take up the opportunities that are given here, most people don't want to leave. David Nathan calls it being a lifer. This is a good product, and it isn't just the physicians and the scientists. I think of our nurses. I think of nurses I've known here who came out of high school, were going to college, went to nursing school, they started here. They got married, they had their babies, they somehow kept working here, and they continue working here, and they find a role here. It sort of becomes a bit of an addiction because it is a special place. The product is so outstanding, and the goal, the value system, the purpose of the place is so clearly defined. If you think of people as disparate as Ted Williams, who somehow found a reason to wander over here and be with the kids, people are drawn to a place like this, and there are many of us who have had opportunities to be outside the 617 area code. There are people, many of us, 7 of us actually have been president of the American Society of Clinical Oncology. We've done things, on a national level, but this is home.